My wife cheated with her old friend. After our divorce, I tried rebuilding my life, but then she tried crawling back. Alright, so here I am, writing this with a pit in my stomach. I never thought I'd be sharing my story on a subreddit, but I'm at a loss and need advice. My name's Chris, and my wife's name is Ashley. We've been married for 12 years, and up until a few months ago, I thought everything was good, normal even. But that's the thing with life, isn't it? You don't notice things slipping until you're already halfway down the slide. It all started when Ashley reconnected with an old college friend, Jake. Now, I'm not the jealous type, or at least I didn't think I was. Ashley told me they hadn't spoken in years, and when they ran into each other at some networking event, they decided to catch up. I was fine with it, heck, I even encouraged it. Everyone needs their own friends, right? But here's where things started to feel off. It wasn't just the fact that she was hanging out with Jake, it was how quickly she became obsessed with reconnecting. First, it was coffee once a month, then every week. Then they started texting all the time. Every night, after she thought I had fallen asleep, I'd hear the buzzing of her phone. She'd laugh, whispering replies, as if she didn't want to wake me. Maybe I'm crazy, I thought. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I ignored it for a while, telling myself that I was just overthinking things. But then, the lies started. It was subtle at first. She'd tell me she was meeting Jake for coffee, but when I called to check in, I'd hear the background noise of a bar instead of a cafe. Or she'd say she had work meetings late, but would come home wearing perfume I didn't recognize, stuff she never wore around me. One night, she said she had to stay late at the office for a client meeting. Something in my gut told me to check. I called her office at 8 p.m., but the line went straight to voicemail. That's when I knew something was up. I didn't want to be that guy, the paranoid, overbearing husband, so I tried brushing it off. But it kept nagging at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. So, I started paying more attention. I didn't snoop through her phone or anything, but I noticed she was acting more distant. She'd stop looking me in the eyes when we talked, or she'd be glued to her phone, laughing at messages I never got to see. Then, one evening, while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed. I know, I shouldn't have looked, but something made me reach for it. A message flashed on the screen from Jake. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. My heart dropped. I couldn't believe it. I just stood there, staring at her phone, replaying the message in my head. Last night was amazing? She told me she was working late. How could she be so casual, so bold? I mean, how long had this been going on? I put the phone down, my hands shaking. Part of me wanted to confront her right there and then, but another part of me was scared. Scared that if I asked, it would make everything real. So I waited. I didn't say a word that night. Instead, I started watching her more closely. She'd say she was going to the gym, but I'd notice her coming back with perfectly styled hair and fresh makeup. She'd claim she was out shopping with her sister, but her sister hadn't mentioned anything about it when I casually asked. The next weekend, I decided to follow her. Yeah, I know it sounds crazy, but I couldn't take it anymore. She said she was meeting Jake to talk about some project they were working on together. So, I waited until she left, grabbed my car keys, and tailed her. Sure enough, she didn't go anywhere near a coffee shop or an office. She drove straight to a hotel. I sat in the parking lot, watching her walk inside, my stomach in knots. A part of me thought, maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe I'm wrong. But that part was shrinking fast. I waited for almost 2 hours before she came back out, laughing, with Jake right behind her. They got into separate cars like nothing had happened. That was the moment I knew. There was no turning back. I couldn't take it anymore. After seeing them walk out of that hotel like nothing was wrong, like I didn't exist, my mind was racing. I drove home, barely remembering the trip back, my thoughts consumed with what I'd seen. I knew I couldn't keep quiet any longer. When Ashley walked through the door later that evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table, waiting. She had this casual, cheerful look on her face, like she hadn't just spent the day lying to me. That's what killed me, the normalcy of it all. Hey, she said, setting her purse down, what's for dinner? I stared at her for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Where were you? I asked, my voice calmer than I felt inside. She hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. I told you I was with Jake, working on that project. I nodded, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment before I spoke again. Funny. I followed you today. Her face went pale. What? She stammered. I followed you. I know you went to a hotel with Jake. I saw you both walk out together. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But instead, she turned defensive. You followed me? She snapped, as if I were the one in the wrong. Are you serious, Chris? What the hell is wrong with you? I couldn't believe it. She was trying to flip it on me, like I was the one at fault here. Don't turn this around on me, Ashley. You've been lying to me for weeks, maybe months. Just admit it. She crossed her arms and looked away, refusing to meet my eyes. It's not what you think, she muttered. Jake and I. It just happened. I didn't mean for it to get this far. Get this far. I felt a lump in my throat. You've been sleeping with him, haven't you? She didn't answer, but she didn't have to. Her silence was all the confirmation I needed. Her silence hit me harder than any words ever could. That was it. She wasn't going to deny it. She wasn't going to apologize, explain, or beg for forgiveness. Just silence. And in that silence, I felt everything. The betrayal, the anger, the sadness, all at once. It was like someone had ripped my heart out and replaced it with a dull, empty ache. So how long has it been going on? I asked, my voice shaking with a mix of rage and disbelief. She bit her lip, still not looking at me. A few months. I could barely breathe. Months. I had been living in this lie for months. Does he know you're married? That we have a life together? Or does he just not care? Ashley finally looked at me, and for a split second, I thought I saw guilt in her eyes. He knows, she whispered. He doesn't care. He's going through a divorce himself, and we just connected. Connected? That's what she was calling this? A connection? I felt like laughing, but there was nothing funny about it. And what about us, Ashley? What about our connection? She let out a frustrated sigh, running her hands through her hair. I don't know, Chris. Things haven't been good between us for a while. I felt so distant. You're always working, and when you're home, we barely talk. I didn't plan this with Jake, it just happened. That's your excuse? I snapped. I work hard to provide for us, for you. And instead of talking to me, you go and sleep with some guy behind my back. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't care. I didn't know what else to do, she said quietly. I was lonely. And Jake, he made me feel special again. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was justifying it. She was trying to justify cheating on me. So that's it then? You throw away 12 years of marriage because you were lonely? Her silence answered the question. The room felt like it was spinning. I stood there, unable to move, as if her confession had physically knocked the wind out of me. 12 years of marriage, all reduced to this, loneliness. I thought about the birthdays, the anniversaries, the countless small moments that built our life together. And now, none of it seemed to matter to her. I gave you everything, I whispered, more to myself than to her. I worked my ass off to make sure we were comfortable, to give you the life you wanted. And you throw it away for some guy who just made you feel special? Ashley wiped her eyes, but I could see she wasn't sobbing. There were no desperate apologies or heartfelt pleas to fix things. She just stood there broken, but in a way that told me she had already made up her mind. I never meant to hurt you, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't wake up one day and decide to ruin everything. But Chris, I'm not happy. I haven't been for a long time. My chest tightened. Not happy? She never told me. She never gave me the chance to make it right. Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you come to me before this got so out of hand? She shook her head. I don't know. I tried. But every time I wanted to talk, it just felt like you were miles away. You're always so focused on work or exhausted when you come home. I didn't want to be another problem you had to solve. Ashley, I would have done anything for you. You know that, right? My voice cracked, and I hated how vulnerable I sounded. But it was the truth. I would have moved mountains for her. She nodded slowly. I know, Chris. I do. But somewhere along the way, we lost each other. That hit hard. The worst part? Maybe she was right. Maybe we had drifted apart, and I hadn't even noticed. But I wasn't the one who broke us. She was. She went behind my back, and that's what stung the most. I couldn't look at her anymore. What do you want, Ashley? I asked quietly. Do you want to stay? Do you want to fix this? Or are you done with us? She hesitated, and in that pause, I felt everything crumbling around me. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I don't know, Chris. I really don't know. Her words, I don't know, echoed in my mind, like a nail in the coffin of our marriage. It was as if she was already halfway out the door, but still too afraid to make the final move. And that hurt more than anything, the indecision. The fact that she didn't even know if we were worth fighting for. I stood up, not trusting myself to stay in that room any longer. I couldn't take looking at her, couldn't take feeling the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. I needed air. I needed space. I'm going for a drive, I said, my voice cold and distant. She didn't try to stop me, didn't call after me as I grabbed my keys and walked out the door. The house felt different now, like it wasn't even mine anymore. The walls that had once been filled with laughter and memories now felt like strangers, foreign, hollow, empty. I drove around aimlessly for what felt like hours. I don't even remember half the streets I turned down. My mind kept going back to that one question: how did we get here? I replayed every moment, every sign I might have missed, trying to figure out where things had gone so wrong. Sure, I worked a lot, but that was to give us a good life. I thought we were doing fine. I thought we were happy. But clearly, I was living in some alternate reality where my wife wasn't sneaking off to sleep with another man. Finally, I pulled over at some random parking lot, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. And that's when the tears came. I hadn't cried yet. Not during the confrontation, not during the drive, but sitting alone in that car, the floodgates opened. The anger, the sadness, the betrayal, it all came crashing down, and I just broke. After what felt like forever, I wiped my eyes and took a deep breath. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: things could never go back to the way they were. Not after this. I started the car again, not ready to go home, but knowing I couldn't avoid it forever. When I finally walked back through the front door, the house was silent. Ashley wasn't in the living room. She wasn't waiting for me. I found her in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale and lost in thought. She looked up when I came in, but we didn't say anything to each other for a long time. Finally, I broke the silence. What do we do now? She didn't answer right away. She just looked down at her hands, like she was weighing something heavy in her mind. And then, after what felt like an eternity, she whispered, "Maybe we should take a break. Figure out what we really want." My heart sank, but I knew she was right. We weren't in a place where we could fix anything, not yet. So, we decided to separate for a while. She'd stay with her sister, and I'd keep the house. It wasn't what I wanted, but it felt like the only option left. The next few days felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life. Ashley packed her things quietly, without much discussion. We didn't talk about Jake, or what had happened. It was like we were pretending everything was normal, even though it wasn't. I watched her load her car with bags, each one a reminder that our life together was falling apart. She wasn't taking everything, just enough for what could turn into something permanent. We didn't say it out loud, but we both knew. This wasn't just a break to clear our heads. This could be the end. Before she left, she turned to me and said softly, "Chris, I'm sorry. I never wanted it to get this far." I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I know. There wasn't anything else to say. Apologies felt empty now, like they couldn't fix the damage. I didn't ask if she was going to see Jake. It didn't matter anymore. She leaned in for a hug, but I stepped back. I wasn't ready for that. Without another word, she got in her car and drove off, leaving me alone in a house that felt suddenly too big. That first night alone was strange. I sat in the living room, staring at the TV but not really watching. The silence was deafening. I had spent years being comforted by her presence, her laughter, the little sounds of her moving around the house. Now it was just me, the ticking clock, and the weight of everything I had lost. I tried to sleep in our bed that night, but it felt wrong. The space where she used to sleep was cold and empty. After hours of tossing and turning, I grabbed a blanket and moved to the couch. That became my routine over the next few days, sleeping on the couch at night, and during the day throwing myself into work. But no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, the pain was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. A few days later, I got a message from Ashley: "We should talk." I wasn't ready, but I knew it had to happen. When she came over, we sat at the kitchen table, the same place where I'd confronted her. Neither of us spoke at first. After what felt like forever, she broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot about us. About what went wrong." I stayed quiet, waiting for her to continue. "I know I hurt you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe we weren't as happy as we thought we were." Her words stung, but I couldn't argue. Maybe she was right. Maybe we had been coasting for a while, ignoring the cracks. She looked down at her hands. "I don't want to lose you, Chris. But I don't know if we can go back to how things were." "I don't know either," I admitted. "But we can't just keep avoiding this." We sat in silence, two people who used to share everything, now feeling like strangers. Finally, I asked, "What do you want to do?" I don't know, she said softly. But I think we need more time apart. To figure out what we really want. And just like that, the distance between us grew even wider. After Ashley left that night, the reality of our separation started to sink in. The house, once filled with her presence, now felt unbearably quiet. Days turned into a blur of routine, waking up, working, coming home to silence. Even though I had more space, it felt suffocating. I tried to distract myself with work, diving into projects and staying at the office later than usual. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the thought of her was always there, just beneath the surface. I kept replaying our last conversation in my mind, trying to make sense of everything. Part of me wondered if she was really taking time to think things over, or if she was already moving on with Jake. Then, a week after she moved out, I got a call from her. "Hey Chris," she said, her voice sounding distant. "Can we meet up? There's something we need to talk about." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "Sure," I replied, though I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever conversation was coming next. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop we used to go to when we were dating, which only made the situation more surreal. When I arrived, she was already sitting at a table, looking down at her phone. I couldn't help but notice how different she looked, more composed, like the weight of our relationship wasn't pressing on her as hard as it was on me. She put her phone down when she saw me and gave a small, awkward smile. "Thanks for meeting me." I nodded, sitting across from her. "What's going on?" She hesitated, looking out the window for a moment before turning back to me. "I've been thinking about us, and I think it's time we consider moving forward with a divorce." The words hit me like a punch in the gut, even though I had suspected it was coming. Hearing her say it out loud made it real. "I don't want to keep dragging this out," she continued. "We both deserve to move on and figure out what we really want." I sat there, staring at her, trying to process it. After everything we'd been through, after 12 years together, it was all coming down to this. "Is this what you really want?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. She nodded, her expression sad but resolute. "I think it's what's best for both of us." There wasn't much left to say after that. We talked about logistics, splitting up our things, how we'd handle the legal process, but the conversation felt mechanical, like we were just checking boxes on a list. The emotional connection between us had already unraveled, and now we were just tying up the loose ends. When we left the coffee shop, I felt a sense of finality wash over me. This wasn't just a break anymore, it was the end of everything we had built together. As I watched her drive away, I realized the distance between us wasn't just physical. We had become two different people, and there was no going back. After our talk at the coffee shop, things moved quickly. It was like the moment we agreed to divorce, the floodgates opened, and everything started to fall apart faster than I was ready for. Papers were drawn up, and meetings with lawyers took over what little communication we had left. Ashley and I barely spoke, except for discussions about dividing our assets and making the process as smooth as possible. Each time I saw her name pop up on my phone or an email from her, I felt that same hollow ache. We had shared everything, our lives, our dreams, our home, and now it was all reduced to legal jargon and signatures. One afternoon, I came home to a half-empty house. She'd come by while I was at work to pick up the last of her things. I hadn't expected it to hit me as hard as it did. Seeing the empty spaces where her things used to be, her side of the closet, the dresser, even the small personal touches like her favorite coffee mug, it felt like someone had erased her from my life, piece by piece. That night, I stood in my living room, and it all came crashing down. Everything we'd built was gone. The future I thought we were working toward, the memories we were supposed to make, it was all over. I realized that I wasn't just losing her, I was losing the version of myself that existed when we were together. A few days later, we met for the last time at the lawyer's office to finalize everything. I tried to keep my emotions in check, but sitting across from her, I couldn't help but remember the good times, the laughter, the quiet moments, the love we once shared. It felt so distant now, like it belonged to another life. When we signed the papers, it was oddly quiet. No more arguments, no more tension, just a strange sense of relief and finality. This was it. This was the end. As we stood outside the office, ready to go our separate ways for good, Ashley looked at me one last time. "I hope you find happiness, Chris," she said softly. "I really do." I wanted to say something, anything, but all I could manage was a nod. "You too, Ashley." And with that, she walked away. No big emotional goodbye, no dramatic ending. Just two people who had once loved each other, now strangers going their separate ways. I stood there for a while after she left, watching as she disappeared down the street. It felt like a chapter of my life had closed, and now I was standing on the edge of something unknown. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: there was no going back. It was time to start over. Alone. After Ashley walked away for the last time, I stood in that same spot outside the lawyer's office for what felt like hours. The world around me kept moving, but I was frozen. It was over. The life we had built, the person I thought I would grow old with, it was all behind me now. The first few days after the divorce were the hardest. Every corner of the house reminded me of her. Her favorite chair, the empty space on the bathroom counter where her things used to be, the bed that now felt too big for one person. I thought I'd feel some kind of freedom, but instead, all I felt was an emptiness that settled into my bones. I tried to keep busy, to fill the silence with anything I could, work, TV, even late-night runs just to exhaust myself. But no matter how hard I pushed, the loneliness was always there, waiting for me when I stopped. It wasn't just the loss of her that hurt, it was the loss of the routine, the loss of what we had built together. The everyday things we used to take for granted were gone, and I wasn't sure how to rebuild. People told me I'd heal in time. They said it would get easier, that I'd find a way to move on. But no one tells you what to do in those first few weeks, when the pain is still fresh and you're grappling with the reality of being alone. Friends reached out, offering their support, but I wasn't ready to talk about it. I wasn't ready to admit to anyone, least of all myself, how broken I felt. Then came the inevitable questions. What now? How do you start over after something like this? I had spent so much of my life being part of a couple that I wasn't sure who I was on my own anymore. I had been Chris and Ashley for so long, now I was just Chris. And I didn't know what that looked like. One evening, after another long day of trying to outrun my thoughts, I found myself sitting in the backyard, staring at the stars. It was quiet, peaceful even, in a way that hadn't been before. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to feel the weight of everything, to let the sadness wash over me instead of fighting it. And in that moment, something shifted. I realized that as much as this hurt, it was also a chance for something new. A chance to rediscover who I was, not as part of a couple, but as myself. I didn't know what that journey would look like yet, and I didn't have all the answers, but I knew it was a journey I had to take. The healing wouldn't come overnight, I knew that. But maybe, just maybe, there was hope on the other side of all this pain. It wasn't about forgetting Ashley or erasing the past. It was about accepting that part of my life was over and finding a way to move forward, even if it was slow and messy. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of calm. The house was still quiet, still too big for one person, but it felt different. Like it was no longer just a reminder of what I had lost, but a blank slate, an opportunity to rebuild. I wasn't sure where I was going, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready to start figuring it out. As the days passed, that sense of calm I had felt in the backyard began to grow. It wasn't constant. There were still moments when the grief hit me like a wave, when I'd walk into a room and be reminded of Ashley, or catch myself thinking about her. But those moments started to get fewer, and when they came, they didn't knock me down the way they used to. I was starting to heal, slowly but surely. I decided to make some changes around the house. At first, it felt like a way to distract myself, but it turned into something more. I repainted the living room, rearranged the furniture, and even got rid of a few things that were too tied to our life together. It wasn't about erasing her from the house, it was about making it feel like mine again, creating a space that reflected who I was becoming. The more I worked on the house, the more I started to feel in control again. I realized that while Ashley had been a huge part of my life, she didn't define me. I had the power to shape my future, to decide what my life would look like from here on out. It was empowering, in a way I hadn't expected. I also started reaching out to friends more. At first, it was hard. I didn't want to talk about the divorce, didn't want to be the guy who couldn't move on. But my friends didn't push. They just wanted to be there, to help me rebuild. Slowly, I started to let them back in. We went out for drinks, caught up on life, and for the first time in months, I started to feel like myself again. One evening, I got a text from an old friend, Greg, who I hadn't seen in a while. He suggested we grab a beer, and I agreed, figuring it would be nice to catch up. We met at a bar downtown, and after a few drinks, the conversation turned to Ashley. I hadn't planned on talking about it, but something about the setting made it easier. You know, Greg said, this doesn't define you. What happened, it sucks. But it doesn't have to be the thing that holds you back. I nodded, taking a sip of my beer. I get that, but it's still hard. It's like I'm trying to rebuild, but there are pieces of me missing. Greg smiled, leaning back in his chair. That's the thing about rebuilding. Sometimes you don't need all the old pieces. You can use new ones. That stuck with me. I had spent so much time thinking about what I had lost, I hadn't considered that I could create something new, something better. It wasn't about piecing my old life back together, but about building a new one that was entirely my own. In the weeks that followed, I embraced that idea. I started going for runs again, something I hadn't done since before the divorce. I reconnected with hobbies I'd forgotten about: woodworking, photography. I wasn't trying to fill the void left by Ashley, I was discovering things about myself that had nothing to do with her. Things that were just mine. The pain wasn't gone, and I didn't expect it to be. Healing isn't a straight line. But I was moving forward, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was heading in the right direction. Life wasn't going to look the way I had once imagined, but that didn't mean it couldn't be good. It just meant it would be different. And maybe, just maybe, different was exactly what I needed. As more time passed, I began to embrace the changes in my life. The once stifling quiet of the house started to feel peaceful rather than lonely. I found comfort in the routines I was creating, the small moments of solitude that allowed me to reconnect with myself. It was strange, but in a way, this forced break from everything I knew gave me the space to grow. I continued making the house my own, replacing old memories with new ones. I framed some of my photography and hung it on the walls, filled the bookshelf with new titles, and even bought a new couch. It felt symbolic, like each change was a step further away from the life I had shared with Ashley and closer to the life I was building for myself. Then one day, something unexpected happened. I was at the grocery store, minding my own business, when I ran into someone I hadn't seen in years. Sarah, a woman I had worked with briefly at my old job. We chatted for a few minutes, catching up on life. She was warm, funny, and easy to talk to. After a bit of small talk, she casually mentioned grabbing coffee sometime. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sure if I was ready for something like that. But after we exchanged numbers and I walked away, I found myself smiling. It wasn't a big deal, just a coffee, but it felt like a glimpse of the person I used to be before everything went sideways. A few days later, I decided to text her. We met up at a local cafe, and for the first time in a long while, I felt genuinely excited. We spent a couple of hours talking about everything: work, life, hobbies. There was no pressure, no expectations. It wasn't a date, just two people reconnecting. And that was exactly what I needed. Over the next few weeks, we hung out a few more times, grabbing lunch or catching a movie. I hadn't realized how much I missed simple things like laughing with someone or talking about life outside of work and the divorce. Sarah wasn't a replacement for Ashley, she wasn't meant to be. But she was a reminder that there was still life to be lived, still moments of happiness to be found. At some point it hit me, I was healing. Not in one big dramatic moment, but slowly, day by day. The pain of the divorce hadn't vanished, but it no longer consumed me. I had made space for new experiences, new people, and most importantly, a new version of myself. I wasn't trying to rebuild the past anymore, I was learning to embrace the future. I had no idea where things with Sarah would go, and honestly, that didn't matter. What mattered was that I was open to the possibility of something new. I had spent so long feeling stuck in the past, but now I could see that the future held so much potential. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. Life wasn't going to be perfect, and I still had moments where the weight of everything hit me all over again. But I was learning that it was okay to move on, to let go of the life I had planned and be open to the one that was unfolding before me. And that was enough. As the months passed, I found myself looking back on my life with Ashley less and less. It wasn't that I had forgotten her, or what we went through, it's just that those memories no longer held the same power over me. They were a part of my story, yes, but they didn't define who I was anymore. I had changed. I could feel it in the way I approached my days, how I felt about myself, and the choices I was making. The bitterness, the anger, the hurt, they were all still there, but they had faded into the background, making room for something else. Something lighter. Maybe it was peace. Ashley and I hadn't spoken since the divorce was finalized, and while that silence once felt like a gaping hole, now it felt right. We had both moved on, in our own ways, and clinging to what was left of our relationship wouldn't do either of us any good. It was time to fully let go. I decided to do something I hadn't been ready for until now. I cleared out the last of her things. There were still a few boxes in the attic filled with old photos, mementos from trips, and small items she had left behind. I had avoided them, thinking that holding on to them somehow kept that part of my life intact. But now, it was time to let go. One Saturday morning, I went up to the attic and carefully sorted through the boxes. As I sifted through the items, I allowed myself a moment to remember the good times we had shared. There had been plenty of them, after all. But I didn't dwell on them. Instead, I packed them away with a sense of closure, knowing that I was ready to move forward. By the time I finished, I felt lighter, like a weight I didn't realize I was carrying had finally been lifted. I donated some of the items, stored the photos away in a safe place, and threw out the rest. It wasn't an emotional purge, just a quiet acknowledgement that this chapter of my life had ended. In the weeks that followed, I noticed a shift in my outlook. Life didn't feel as heavy anymore. I felt more open to new experiences, more present in my daily routines. I had started making plans again, taking weekend trips, signing up for a photography class, even considering joining a local running group. It felt good to be focusing on my future again, rather than being weighed down by the past. Sarah and I continued to see each other, but it remained casual. We both understood that we were in different stages of our lives, and neither of us wanted to rush into anything serious. It was refreshing to have a connection that wasn't tied to expectations or pressure, just two people enjoying each other's company. Whether it turned into something more didn't matter, I was content with where things stood. One night, after spending the evening with Sarah, I sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee, staring up at the stars. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking about Ashley or the divorce or what I had lost. I was just content. I had been through so much, and there were times when I thought I'd never find my way out of the darkness. But here I was, still standing, still moving forward, and for the first time, genuinely excited for what lay ahead. The past no longer defined me, and I had finally let it go. This was my life now, and it was mine to shape however I wanted. It wasn't one big moment that signaled I had moved on, it was the accumulation of small victories. The gradual shift from focusing on the past to embracing the present. I had let go of the old version of myself, the one defined by my marriage to Ashley, and was learning to embrace the person I had become. One morning as I sat drinking coffee and looking out the window, it hit me, I was happy. Not in the same way I had been before, when happiness was tied to the plans Ashley and I had made, but in a deeper, more personal way. I had learned to find joy in the little things, my morning runs, new friendships, the creative projects I had taken on. My life wasn't perfect, but it felt like mine again. That weekend, I decided to take a solo trip to the mountains, a place I had always wanted to explore but never made time for. I packed up my gear, threw a camera in my bag, and set off with no particular plan in mind. It was liberating, to just go and experience something on my own terms. The trip turned out to be exactly what I needed. The quiet of the mountains, the fresh air, the space to think, it all helped to clear my head. I spent my days hiking, taking photos, and just breathing in the peace that surrounded me. There were no distractions, no noise, just me and the world around me. On the last day, as I stood at the top of a trail, looking out over the valley below, I felt a wave of contentment wash over me. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking backward or worrying about what might come next. I was simply present, grateful for where I was in that moment. I realized then that I had made it through. The pain of the divorce, the heartbreak, the uncertainty about the future, it was all still a part of me, but it no longer defined me. I had learned to carry it without letting it weigh me down. I had built something new, something strong, out of the pieces that had been broken. When I got home, I found myself smiling more. The house, once a symbol of everything I had lost, now felt like a sanctuary, a place I had reclaimed for myself. I didn't know what the future held, but I was no longer afraid of it. Whatever came next, I was ready for it. Sarah and I continued to spend time together, and while I wasn't sure where things would lead, I wasn't in a rush to figure it out. I had learned to take things day by day, to let life unfold at its own pace. In the end, the journey wasn't about finding a new relationship or erasing the past, it was about rediscovering myself. About learning that I was capable of rebuilding, of finding happiness again, even after everything had fallen apart. As I stood on the porch that evening, watching the sun set, I felt a deep sense of peace. I had come through the hardest chapter of my life, and while the scars were still there, they no longer hurt. They were just reminders of how far I had come. This was my new beginning. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready for whatever came next.